Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Vu, and before I get into what I'm talking about today, I would like to ask you, the audience, some questions to think about throughout this podcast. Look back in your life, and no matter how old or young you are, try remembering your childhood. Now think about the people who raised you, and how you think they raised you. Strict? A bunch of rules you had to follow? Or did you have all the freedom you ever wanted? Now finally think about what would happen if they raised you differently, and what kind of person you would be now. That is what I will be talking about today. How parents' roles in their child's lives can affect them in their future. Almost everyone has a parent figure in their lives and relied on them from time to time throughout their childhood. For me, my parents were very strict. They had a lot of rules I had to abide by, and they really didn't let me do anything outside of school. There's this saying about how strict parents raise sneaky kids, and when I look back on it, I can kind of feel some truth with that statement. With the strict parents that raised me in that kind of environment, when growing up, I learned to ignore rules set upon by my parents to seek social interactions with my friends, and have a fun time during the later years of my childhood. Well, that's a little bit about me now. I want to dive deeper into some science behind a child's development and how parents interacting with their children, good or bad, can affect their development. I found an article published in December of 2022 in the Developmental Review Journal about examining the roles of parents and teachers in the executive function development in the early to middle years of childhood, made by Sumay Koskulu Sankar with their co-authors, who are all from Utrecht University, who specializes in behavioral sciences and youth development. In this article, they talk about something called executive functions, EF for an abbreviated version. And executive functions, as they describe it, are a high-valued thinking process that allowed you to control your actions, emotions, and thoughts. They talk about how the EF development links really well with the social interactions between parent and child. These developments can show up in the first year of a child's life. For example, some things that may emerge are control of attention and self-regulation. Interactions with parents can help a child learn the basics, like knowing what they are doing is right or wrong. It will help them be able to begin thinking for themselves already. I also want to bring in another source that I found, which was made back in May 14th, 2021 by a professor from the University of California, Yuko Munakata, who specializes in the Department of Psychology. She begins to talk about how there are many factors to take into account when you are trying to determine how a child will end up in the future. And it is like predicting a hurricane from a flap of a butterfly's wing. Later in the TED Talk, Yuko begins to explain how not every child is the same. For example, divorce could mean bad news for the oldest child, but relief for the youngest. Your parenting can lead to the oldest hating you and the youngest loving you. This brings up a good point on how you can't have the same parenting with all your children. Because if it works for one child, doesn't mean it works for the others. So what can we take away from these sources? Parents have a big influence on the thinking skills of their children, and that parents have to always adjust their roles to their children to make them become the best they can. With that being said, we now know how important parenting really is. Now, I want to ask everyone some more questions to think about. When you think back on your life, do you remember having a bad interaction with your parents? Did your parents argue a lot? Then, if you can remember, what were your feelings or emotions during that time? In this next segment, I would like to talk about what can happen when parents have a sort of negative influence on their children, and how these negative influence can be something as simple as parents arguing with each other. Everyone has bad moments, right? Might be the amount of stress coming from work or school, and with all that built up stress, you might feel that you might burst if you don't let it out. Don't worry, because I have experienced something like this. A burst of anger because I couldn't hold in whatever was happening with my surroundings. There was a time in my life where I couldn't take criticism from my own parents anymore, so that with the anger that came out, I harmed the relationship I had with my parents. Now think about your parents and how they have to go to work every day and get home tired, but still have to tend to housework and pay bills. You can see what I'm getting at, right? Parents have a lot of responsibilities, and with that, a lot of built-in stress. So at times, parents can have sudden outbursts and it's not their fault. I found a TED Talk made by Fiona Douglas, and it talks in the video called "How Did Your Parents Mess You Up?" made on January 3rd, 2018. Fiona talks about the lasting effects parents can leave on their children from saying something negative out of an outburst of emotion or in anger. Let's bring in another source made by Nicolene Peck, who is a professional when it comes to parenting and has made many literature regarding this topic. In this video, made in January of 2021, Peck talks about how parents arguing with each other can affect their children. This can include sort of detachment from parents, to taking sides, lying habits being picked up, and even developing bad behavioral habits because growing up at home isn't a good environment for children. Now, if all this can happen from just arguing, imagine something much worse that parents do that can negatively affect their children. Now, I want to ask you guys, was there something your parents did or has said to you that you wish they never did? How did you feel about it then? And when you think back, how do you feel about it now? The scars you get from childhood really cut deep within you and can shape your future. Even the best parents have these kinds of flaws in their parenting skills, and because of those flaws in all of the parents, it can cause children to develop traumas for a variety of different things. Now that we just wrapped up talking about the effects of parenting on children, I would like to go more detail in some personal experience I have in my story with my parents. Where my story plays into this is that I didn't think my parents were necessarily good parents, but they weren't the worst parents. And before you all think that, geez, this guy isn't grateful for everything his parents did for him, I am grateful that they got me food, clothes, a house over my head. But I'm here to talk about more than just the basic necessities for parents. If you have a child, isn't it already signing a moral contract that says you will provide food, clothes, housing, and love? So what I'm trying to say is that they didn't do anything more than that. Like I mentioned in the beginning, they were very strict parents with a lot of rules. With those rules, my childhood had barely any social interactions with anybody. I would like to say this was the reason why I became mature very quickly, because I never got to act like a kid. Comparing my childhood with one of my best friends, we had basically polar opposites. With the fact that his parents didn't have any restrictions at all and he was free. With that, I became introverted, of course, since I wasn't able to go out much and my friend became extroverted. So, with my parents being so strict, it made me, when I was more of a teenager, strive to gain more freedom. And that leads to being a sneaky kid and doing things my parents would not know. This is a very specific example of the effects strict parents have on their a child's development. Now I want to show you a broader scope of the effects of authoritative parenting instead of the specific effects like it did for me. I found an article which is more credible published by Anita Fayante with her co-authors titled, "Is Authoritative Parenting the Best Parenting Style?" Made in 2021. This source talks about authoritative parenting and goes into the effects it can have on children. For example, strict parenting can help their children from having behavioral problems and perform better in school. But because of the parents' cold or psychological control over their children, the children can develop internalizing mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And because of the strict parenting, the children would be more hesitant when voicing out their concerns. I would know because I lived in that environment. After talking about my personal experiences, I would like to try to conclude this by talking more about what I personally think about what parenting really is. First, I would like to say that parenting is hard, and everyone should know that. It should be the people who acknowledge that it is hard, but still would like to strive and become good parents to have kids. I would say that too much love and spoiling your kid can act like a sort of poison for your child when they grow to be an adult. But neglecting your child or having to be strict with rules or boundaries can lead to an even worse life. Like everything in life, there is a balance point. And for parenting, the balance point varies from family to family. It should be the job of the parents to find a way to balance out their role so that their children can grow up to be the best person they can ever be. Well, thank you all for listening to this podcast. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you take away something from this podcast. Goodbye.